It was supposed to be a coronation. On the 27th of July, 2025, the youngest head of state in Africa was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The world gasped. Headlines hailed a new Mandela, a new Gandhi, a new torchbearer for peace. For a continent so often silenced, this looked like recognition at last. And then, the thunderclap. Only 3 days later, Ibrahim Traoré did what no one expected. He refused the prize. Not with hesitation, but with fire. This is not an honor, he declared. It is a trap. In that instant, the Nobel's golden medal turned into what he called a velvet chain. Beautiful to the eye, deadly to the spirit. Why would a young leader walk away from $1.1 million and the most prestigious award in the world? Was this reckless pride or the birth of a new chapter in Africa's story? Do not look away. What follows is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and stay with us as we walk through the fire of this refusal and discover what it means for sovereignty, dignity, and the future of the world. At first, it looked like triumph. On the 27th of July, 2025 in Oslo, the Nobel Committee announced a name that reverberated across continents. Ibrahim Traoré, the captain from Burkina Faso, who had risen from the barracks to the presidency. The world's newspapers lit up. Analysts spoke of him in the same breath as Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, icons who had stood as symbols of resistance. To many, this nomination felt like an overdue recognition, a crown for Africa's youngest leader. But in Ouagadougou, the celebration never began. Beneath the surface, Traoré saw something different. The prize, glittering in prestige, carried a shadow. In his eyes, it was not a medal of honor, but a carefully crafted leash. He recognized the pattern, a prize that celebrates only those willing to fit within the frame drawn by powerful capitals. A gold-painted mask designed not to honor, but to contain. 3 days later, the shock came. On the 30th of July, a formal letter was dispatched to Oslo. In it, Traoré rejected the Nobel Peace Prize outright. He called it a trap, a velvet chain, soft to the touch but binding to the wrist. With those words, the medal turned from a symbol of peace into a mirror reflecting power politics. Why such a radical act? Because the timing revealed too much. While Western capitals hailed the nomination as progress, Traoré asked, progress for whom? Could an award tied to the very powers that profit from war ever be a true prize for peace? He forced the world to face a question it preferred to ignore. Was the Nobel a beacon of justice or a mechanism of control? The consequences were immediate. Headlines that once praised him now split in tone. Western newspapers framed the rejection as arrogance, even recklessness. African commentators hailed it as sovereignty in action, the tearing away of golden chains. In coffee shops, from Accra to Nairobi, students debated whether dignity had finally been placed above dependency. The symbolism ran deeper than prestige. The Nobel Peace Prize is valued at $1.1 million, but the networks it unlocks, the influence it carries, are worth hundreds of millions more. Former laureates often gain access to grants, foundations, speaking platforms, and policy influence that stretch into the billions. To turn away from it was not only to reject money, it was to walk away from an entire machinery of soft power. Yet Traoré did not flinch. At a closed council meeting in Ouagadougou on the 28th of July, he told his advisors, "They want to crown me only to control me. I will never be their puppet." Those words echoed through the room like a manifesto. Some warned of the costs, of frozen aid, of rising borrowing expenses, of diplomatic isolation. But Traoré's stance was firm. Peace cannot be sold, sovereignty cannot be rented, and dignity cannot be bought with medals. In the days that followed, his letter was read aloud in public squares. Crowds gathered. Hashtags like Nobel Trap and True Sovereignty trended across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. On the streets of Lagos, murals appeared with the words, "Dignity is priceless." In Johannesburg, students sang songs of defiance. What Oslo had intended as a moment of celebration turned instead into a storm of resistance. The Nobel, once marketed as the pinnacle of global honor, now stood exposed. It was not rejected by a marginal figure, but by a sitting president in the heart of Africa. The symbolism was powerful. If Burkina Faso could refuse, what else might Africa refuse? Could it be that the age of symbolic recognition was ending, replaced by a hunger for genuine independence? Was this rejection merely a solitary act of defiance, or the first crack in the edifice of global legitimacy? The thunder rolled louder. What began as a letter soon grew into a tempest of words and reactions that shook capitals across the world. On the 28th of July, only one day after the announcement, Traore's voice cut through a private council in Ouagadougou. They want to crown me only to control me. I will never be their puppet. It was more than a declaration. It was a manifesto of refusal. His advisors shifted uneasily. Some warned that Burkina Faso might forfeit over $1.2 billion in potential aid and investments. Western ambassadors whispered of lost opportunities, of doors that might close forever. Yet Traoré did not retreat. By the 30th of July, his formal rejection was delivered to Oslo. Uncompromising, unflinching, and historic. Within hours, social media ignited. Hashtags like Nobel Trap and True Sovereignty surged across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In Accra, students marched with banners declaring, "Dignity is our currency." In Johannesburg, young poets turned his words into spoken performances. In Lagos, street murals painted him not as a laureate, but as a liberator. The response abroad was even more electrifying. In Washington, think tanks scrambled to measure the costs. Some estimated that Burkina Faso's decision could ripple through financial markets, pushing up borrowing costs by 2 to 3 percentage points, $100 to $150 million in additional annual interest. CNN called it reckless symbolism. Yet on Fox News, commentators asked a sharper question. Had the Nobel itself become compromised? The debate reached such intensity that even Donald Trump, now wielding influence in global economic discussions, admitted openly, the Nobel might just be a political trap. His words, rare for an American leader, carried weight, confirming what many had long suspected, but few dared to say. In Europe, the reaction was more visceral. French President Emmanuel Macron reportedly slammed his fist on the table during a late-night cabinet meeting. For Paris, still reeling from African resistance in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso itself, this was more than a snub. It was a direct challenge to French prestige. German officials convened an emergency session, their notes describing a diplomatic breach, a tearing of the fabric that held Western soft power together. In Brussels, EU representatives spoke of an unsettling precedent. What if more leaders began rejecting the rituals of recognition? Japan responded differently. With its cautious diplomacy, Tokyo called the rejection a sign of eroding trust in the international system. The language was restrained, yet the message was clear. If Africa no longer trusted Western-led institutions, how long before Japan's own influence in the continent was diminished? For a nation that had invested over $30 billion in African development through TICAD, the warning was acute. Meanwhile, the streets and digital platforms told another story. On TikTok, short clips of Traoré's speech rejecting the Nobel crossed 40 million views in just 48 hours. In São Paulo, activists connected his defiance to their own battles against IMF dependency. In Mexico City, banners read, "Burkina Faso, refuse the medal, we can refuse the debt." In diaspora communities from London to New York, rallies erupted, signs waving, "Dignity has no price tag." The rejection had transcended borders, from a single act in Ouagadougou to a global conversation on sovereignty. And so the Nobel, once a crown of prestige, now stood as a contested symbol. Was it truly about peace or about shaping the narrative of who deserved to be celebrated? Traoré's act tore open the mask. In that exposure lay the climax, not just of one leader's decision, but of a global reckoning. But would this storm remain symbolic? Or would it ignite into a fire that reshaped the balance of power across continents? The letter had been sent, the declaration made. Now came the reckoning. In the weeks after Ibrahim Traoré's refusal, Burkina Faso entered a new chapter, one where every consequence was measured not in medals, but in survival. Western donors and financial institutions quietly adjusted their spreadsheets. Aid packages worth over $1.2 billion were suddenly in question. Credit agencies revised their ratings, warning of higher risks. Within days, Burkina Faso's borrowing costs were projected to rise by 2 to 3 percentage points, an additional burden of $100 to $150 million each year. For a landlocked nation already navigating conflict and poverty, the numbers looked punishing. Yet on the streets of Ouagadougou, the reaction was different. Street vendors told journalists, "Better to lose a dollar given with strings than to lose our future bought with silence." In markets, murals appeared, golden chains painted broken, with the words, "Dignity is priceless." Students in Bamako, Dakar, and Kinshasa debated whether the Nobel had become nothing more than conditional aid disguised as honor. Professors began including the rejection in civic education. teaching children that sovereignty is defended not just by armies, but by ideas. Cultural life surged with new energy. In Lagos, musicians released singles titled Integrity Over Illusion. In Nairobi, poets performed verses comparing the Nobel to a mask polished to hide exploitation. In Cape Town, activists drew parallels between Traore's stance and Nelson Mandela's refusal to compromise dignity during apartheid negotiations. What was meant to be a medal in Stockholm had become, instead, a festival of resistance across Africa. The Spirit of Traore Festival crystallized this wave. On the 30th of July, thousands filled Independence Square in Ouagadougou. Children recited folktales of golden chains broken by courage. Musicians blended ancestral rhythms with modern beats, singing that sovereignty itself was currency. Economists later calculated that the event generated over $50 million in local revenue, a small symbolic proof that dignity could be an economic driver. But symbolism was only part of the story. The government began redirecting funds previously destined for foreign contractors. $500 million from nationalized gold revenues were channeled into education. Within a single year, nearly 200,000 new students were enrolled. Hospitals received upgrades, farmers were given subsidies for sustainable agriculture, and solar fields in the Sahel began lighting villages that had lived in darkness. For the first time in decades, progress did not arrive through conditional grants. It came from within. Still, the risks remained heavy. International credit agencies widened the spread on Burkina Faso's debt. Wall Street analysts predicted that the refusal could deter investors. Yet, paradoxically, commodity traders speculated in the opposite direction. Gold exports surged as markets began to wonder whether African nations might pivot away from dollar-denominated frameworks. What seemed like isolation now hinted at new possibilities. Trading on terms set not in Brussels or Washington, but in Ouagadougou, Johannesburg, and Abuja. For ordinary citizens, the debate was personal. Parents asked, was the price of sovereignty too high if it meant fewer textbooks or longer waits at clinics? Farmers wondered, would markets still buy their harvest if their nation defied the world's most powerful? The choice was no longer abstract. It was lived in the price of bread, in the interest rate of a loan, in the job security of a family. Yet dignity carried a force of its own. Across the continent, young Africans began to see Traore's rejection not as a loss, but as a statement of possibility. If Burkina Faso could say no, why not Nigeria with its $470 billion economy? Why not South Africa, already part of BRICS? Why not Kenya, a hub of innovation and culture? The rejection had cracked a ceiling, and the question echoing across Africa was whether that ceiling would now collapse. This is where the political dimension sharpened. To many observers, Traore's defiance was more than personal. It was a collective refusal, a line drawn in the sand. For decades, African leaders had bent under the weight of recognition offered by others. But now, in the aftermath of the rejection, an idea was planted. That honor cannot be outsourced. That legitimacy cannot be awarded like a certificate. And so, whispers turned into conversations. Could this act be remembered not merely as the rejection of a medal, but as the seed of something larger? A political wave that might reshape how Africa defined its place in the 21st century? If dignity has become a form of currency, then what becomes of dependency? The storm did not stop at Africa's borders. It rolled outward, shaking the architecture of global diplomacy. When Ibrahim Traoré refused the Nobel Peace Prize, the ripple was felt not only in Oslo or Paris, but in Sao Paulo, Tehran, Manila, and Havana. In Latin America, leaders in Venezuela and Cuba seized on the symbolism. They compared Burkina Faso's act to their own decades of resistance against Washington's dictates. Street protests in Mexico City echoed the defiance with banners declaring, "If Ouagadougou can refuse a medal, we can refuse the debt." Analysts noted that Traoré's gesture had become a rallying cry against conditional aid, linking movements thousands of miles apart into a shared language of resistance. In the Middle East, Iranian and Turkish outlets hailed the decision as a rebirth of the Bandung spirit of 1955, when Asia and Africa first declared their intent to resist colonial dominance. The Arab League went further, inviting Traoré to deliver a special address, casting his rejection as part of a larger movement for sovereignty in the region. Asia, too, felt the tremor. In the Philippines, student groups drew parallels between Traoré's defiance and their own battles with international financial dependency. In India, editorials praised Burkina Faso for refusing symbolic chains and called it a lesson in standing tall against global hierarchies. Even in Beijing and Moscow, analysts quietly acknowledged that a new narrative was forming. If one African leader could defy the Nobel, what else might the global South reject? IMF loans, World Bank conditions, European trade restrictions. But perhaps the most significant reactions came from Africa itself. The African Union debated whether to adopt a collective stance. No more symbolic prizes without structural reform in the awarding process. Universities from Nairobi to Dakar hosted public debates on what they began calling the doctrine of refusal. Activists painted murals with the words, "Recognition is not sovereignty." The sense of possibility spread across the continent like wildfire. Western capitals, however, spoke in harsher tones. Brussels described the rejection as a breach of trust. Berlin called it a tear in the diplomatic fabric. Paris saw it as a direct affront to its influence in West Africa. Yet despite the indignation, a quiet fear lingered. If Burkina Faso could resist, would others follow? Could one act of defiance evolve into a movement strong enough to challenge the very foundations of Western legitimacy? And here lies the paradox. By saying no to a medal, Traoré did not isolate his nation. He linked it to a larger chorus demanding change. His rejection became part of what many began to call the Burkina Faso Revolution. A revolution not of rifles, but of symbols, dignity, and sovereignty. Could one refusal in Ouagadougou redraw the map of global governance itself? What comes after refusal? That was the question whispered across boardrooms, classrooms, and marketplaces in the wake of Traoré's defiance. For Burkina Faso, the path ahead was no longer about medals, but about building a future without the weight of gilded chains. The government began to turn principle into policy. Revenues from nationalized gold mines, once siphoned abroad, were redirected into schools and hospitals. Within a single year, nearly 200,000 new students were enrolled. Classrooms once shuttered by conflict reopened, and hospitals received long overdue upgrades. Farmers, too, felt the change. Subsidies for sustainable agriculture spread across the countryside, while renewable energy projects brought solar fields and wind turbines into villages that had lived in darkness. The ambitions did not stop there. Negotiations for new infrastructure and energy deals valued at over $2.3 billion were carried out without IMF strings attached. For the first time in decades, development was pursued on terms written in Ouagadougou, not dictated in Washington or Brussels. The message was unmistakable. Dignity could be more than symbolism. It could be strategy. Across Africa, the rejection inspired visions of a continental shift. Economists in Lagos debated the possibility of an African monetary fund, free from Western rating agencies. Activists in Cape Town compared the moment to Mandela's refusal to compromise on dignity. In Addis Ababa, murals appeared at the African Union headquarters, depicting Traoré holding a torch with the caption, "Our dignity is our future." These were not mere echoes of defiance. They were signs that a political doctrine was taking root. Yet questions lingered. Could Burkina Faso withstand the economic headwinds of higher borrowing costs? Would foreign investors retreat, leaving the nation more vulnerable? Or could the nation's stand inspire new partnerships with Brazil, India, and Turkey, as early trade agreements suggested? The future shimmered with uncertainty, but also with possibility. For Traoré himself, the choice was never about comfort. It was about charting a course where sovereignty was not negotiable. His rejection was a spark, but whether that spark would burn out or ignite a continent-wide fire remained to be seen. Is this a solitary flame in Ouagadougou, or the dawn of a fire that will light Africa's road ahead? It began with a refusal. One medal, one moment, one voice saying no. Yet in that refusal, Ibrahim Traoré did not lose prestige. He gained something far greater. He gained the soul of a continent. For decades, Africa had been painted as a recipient of aid, of recognition, of labels crafted elsewhere. But with one letter to Oslo, the script was torn. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was not the passive stage upon which others bestowed honor. It became the author of its own story. Traoré's rejection reminded the world that dignity is not granted, it is claimed. And sovereignty is not a medal, it is a lived reality. The consequences are still unfolding. Investors whisper of risk, but students speak of awakening. Aid may diminish, but self-reliance grows. The West calls it reckless. Africa calls it liberation. And in that gap between judgment and pride lies the seed of something new. Perhaps this is not the end of a prize, but the beginning of a doctrine. Across Ouagadougou's streets, the words echo, "Our dignity is our future." Across the diaspora, rallies and murals declare, We are not for sale. And across the globe, young voices are asking, if Burkina Faso can walk away from gilded chains, what else might the world walk away from? This is why the act is remembered not merely as the rejection of a Nobel, but as the ignition of a movement. A movement some already call the Burkina Faso Revolution. A revolution of symbols, of sovereignty, of voices refusing silence. In its heart lies a truth that cannot be polished away, that freedom has no price tag and dignity cannot be traded for applause. So the question remains, was this the solitary defiance of a young captain, or the spark of a larger fire reshaping the 21st century? If one small landlocked nation can resist, what stops the rest of the global south? If this story resonates with you, do not let it end here. Subscribe, share, and keep walking with us. Because the struggle for sovereignty does not belong to one man or one nation. It belongs to all who believe that dignity is priceless,